Fighting morale is one of the most precious commodities of any war, and Ukraine's forces currently seem to be on a high. This Russian equipment is brand new, he says, and it isn't stolen, it's our trophy. Here they are taking camouflage to the next level, soldiers blending into the forest, or enjoying a barbecue in the sun in Kyiv. Ukraine's forces have of course also suffered mass casualties in this war, but they know what the sacrifice is for. Contrast that with this shocking scene in Far Eastern Russia. The shooting took place this morning at a military draft center in Siberia. The draft commander, Alexander Yeliseyev, is critically wounded and taken to hospital. Ruslan Zinin, the 25-year-old shooter, may prefer jail in Russia to death in Ukraine. The minimum sentence for attempted murder is 6 years, for dodging the draft, 10. The desperation to avoid fighting has taken many forms ever since the partial mobilization was announced on Wednesday. Exodus is an obvious one, and this was the Russian border with Finland overnight. These are aerial shots of the border with Georgia, one long traffic jam. The crush has increased ever since reports surfaced that all of Russia's borders may be closed to men of fighting age later this week. Witness Russia's mail drain. Those who have managed to make it to the Georgian capital Tbilisi now feel free to speak their mind about this war.
Россию расчленяют, убивают правительство коррупцией, безнаказанностью абсолютной, лишением всех прав и свобод, выражения мнений.
In Dagestan, in the far south, the police are fighting the men who refuse to fight in a war they don't believe in. The spectre that haunts the Kremlin is 1917, the Bolshevik revolution that toppled the Tsar during an unpopular and unsuccessful war. Facing military setbacks on the battlefield and rancor, if not rebellion at home, Vladimir Putin is calling in favors. This from his bestie in Belarus, President Lukashenko.
Тут я наблюдаю, у нас там мобилизации пугают, здесь кто-то побежал за границу. Ну, слушайте, у России 25 миллионов мобилизационный ресурс. Ну, хорошо, пусть убежали, ну, 30 тысяч, ну, 50 тысяч. Но они что, если бы здесь остались, они что, нашими людьми бы были? Ну, пусть бегут.
Then there's divine intervention, courtesy of Patriarch Kirill, friend of Putin, like him a former KGB agent and spiritual cheerleader of the war, offering absolution in return for military service.
И если в исполнении этого долга человек погибает, то он, несомненно, совершает деяние, равносильное жертве. Он себя приносит в жертву за других. И потому верим, что эта жертва смывает все грехи, которые человек совершил.
In the Kamchatka Peninsula of far eastern Russia, the draftees appear more willing and disciplined. But Mr. Putin's war of choice threatens to undermine his power and fray this vast federation, creating a different kind of eruption. And in the last hour, Russia has announced that it has one more fighting-age man. US whistleblower Edward Snowden has been granted Russian citizenship, but his lawyer says that he cannot be drafted to fight in Ukraine because he has no Russian military service history. Snowden fled the US 9 years ago and has been in Russia ever since, after leaking secret files that revealed vast surveillance operations carried out by the American government. The US want to put him on trial for espionage in the United States. Now, it is a fine and perhaps impossible balance between Russian defeat and Russian desperation to escalate this war, one that Western governments continue to grapple with more than the government here in Kyiv. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Igor Zhokva, the deputy head of President Zelensky's office. I asked him how seriously he took President Putin's threat of nuclear action.
You know, this is not the first time he's threatening not only Ukraine, but the whole civilized world with a nuclear weapon. But this time we should treat it more seriously.
So it's not a bluff?
I don't think it's a bluff. And that's why it's high time now to think of something preventive. Let's not repeat the mistakes of the previous years of reacting to something.
The Americans have said directly and privately to the Russians that if they were to do something like this, the consequences for Russia would be catastrophic. What do you think the Americans meant by that?
Well, obviously we saw those statements. I think the Americans in this case are very serious.
Would it be a nuclear response from the Americans?
I don't know. I don't think that it will be this direct, mirror response. I think it could be a synchronized response.
And given the fact that the stakes have been raised so dramatically, are you hearing what you want to hear from Western governments at the moment? Because it is still possible that Ukraine would be the first target of such a strike.
Well, we're hearing a quite strong reaction, and we saw that the reaction of the world leaders were quite strong during the United Nations General Assembly. But again, a mere reaction now, like a statements, political declarations, in this case would not be enough.
We've got these referendums taking place now in 4 eastern regions. Your president and many others have called these referendums a sham. But does it change the reality of your military offensive in any way? Because if the Russians have said an attack on those territories will be an attack on Russia now.
Never ever armed forces of Ukraine will listen to any Russian statements or will look carefully to the results of sham referendum. I think the results were already or are already written down in these ballots or papers or whatever, and this time schedule of what will happen is already defined in Moscow, not somewhere in those occupied areas.
Finally, if you take everything into account, Vladimir Putin, and his problems at home, the threat of nuclear war, the state of the battlefield here in Ukraine, is this now the most dangerous moment of this war?
I will not call it the most dangerous moment.
Outside Ukraine?
Well, no.
Despite the threat of nuclear war on European soil?
I think all the European countries, not only European countries, European leaders do understand now that it's no use to be afraid of Putin. It's no use to be afraid of Russia. Okay, if you're afraid, so what is left to you? Just to be afraid?
Will this war be over by spring?
Hoping.
You hope?
It's hard to tell you. No one will tell you now when it will end. Much depends on the support of Western countries. I will definitely can tell you that the courage and the will of Ukrainian people and Ukrainian president to win will remain as it is and even stronger. So much depends now on your general support to us.
Igor Jokpa, thank you very much.
Thank you.